Welcome to Inside the Lab, a program bringing you news about research both locally and internationally on autism spectrum disorders. My name is Dr. Christelle Hudry. I'm a lecturer in developmental psychology at La Trobe University and a member of the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre. In the studio today I have two guests with me. Amanda Golding is a parent and a professional working here in Melbourne, and Professor Anne Lukuta is a visitor from the United Kingdom. So thanks for joining us today. Amanda, I'll start with you. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and what your role is?
Well, I work as both a parent and a professional, and I say that specifically because it is hard work being a parent. My son David is 32 and he was diagnosed in 1985 as a 4-year-old, which at the time was quite unusual for him to be identified at such a young age. And I became immediately involved not only in research. In fact, I was David was one of Professor Dissanayaka's first research project
in her PhD,
subjects. Yes. And towards the end of the 1980s, I was employed by the then Victorian Autistic Children's Association, which became Autism Victoria, as their executive officer, and I was there for 16 years.
Yeah, wow.
And since I left there 6 years ago, I've done a number of different, more consultancy type jobs, Parenting Research Centre assisting with the Helping Children with Autism package, program implementation, and I'm also now working much more closely with parents on a voluntary basis as a sort of a parent-to-parent type person with the Autistic Family Support Association.
Great, so you've had a really big involvement in lots of different ways in the city and in the country as a whole in autism. Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, thanks for coming today.
That's my pleasure.
And then Professor Anne Lukuta, who's visiting from Newcastle in the north of England. So do you want to tell us why you're here at the moment?
Good morning. Well, I'm here this time to help Christelle run an autism diagnostic observation schedule training course for this week. I've been involved in helping train on the ADOS, Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, for many, many years. So I started my career training with Michael Rutter at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. I led the British Twin study of autism, and as part of that study we started to develop these diagnostic assessment tools. So I'm one of the authors of the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised, now published, and was working with, as we were developing the ADOS, to work alongside that as a play and activity-based assessment.
Yeah.
So I'm, as you say, now based in the northeast of England, and I moved there to take up the chair of child and adolescent psychiatry because I'm absolutely a clinician at heart, in about the end of 96, so quite a long time ago now. And in the northeast we've developed a clinical academic team, so we run a second opinion service with a title that flies off the tongue, the Complex Neurodevelopmental Disorder Service. So we provide second opinions to clinical teams across the northeast of England. And the other half of my post is we've developed an autism research program. So we're looking at some of the underpinning neurocognitive understanding of the origins of autism. I've carried on my interest in genetics, but we also have a number of programs looking at evaluating early interventions, transition for children as they move from adolescence into adulthood, and we're very excited about a new program of work we're about to start for adults and looking through across adult life and into old age.
Yeah.
Autism
so really
is not a childhood disorder, it's a lifespan
yeah.
disorder.
So you have a very, very varied role as well then in autism in your country, but also internationally very well renowned. So, I mean, we're going to probably talk about a lot of the things again that you've both touched on already today. We are the two of us together running an ADOS course this week. So as you said, it's the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, one of the two sort of key gold standard, we say, in research assessments for helping in the diagnosis of ASDs. Maybe tell us a little bit about your experience of running training courses like with the ADOS, but also the ADI, the Autism Diagnostic Interview in the UK. You have quite a really rich and interconnected network of trainers in the UK, and I think there's a really interesting model there that we can learn from in Australia.
Okay. I suppose the other thing I should first say is, having trained in London and then moved to the northeast of England, I'm also involved in a number of the national strategy guidance documents. So I chaired the National Autism Plan for Children, which was published in 2003, a long time ago now, and since then in the UK we've developed national guidance documents about assessment, diagnosis, and now some work about interventions for children and for adults. So the ADOS for us is something that I first got to know through research, and indeed the ADOS and the developmental history, our autism diagnostic interview, were developed together originally for research purposes.
Yeah.
The wonderful thing though about the ADOS is it gives you such rich clinical material.
Yes.
It is a semi-structured but standardised observational assessment that you can use for children from preschool actually through to able adults.
Right.
Tricky to cross that wide spectrum. So we've in the UK we have a training network, as Christelle says, where those of us that really work in regional clinical academic centres have developed a network to be able to train local clinicians around. So that's a different sort of network around our second opinion centres to facilitate skills development in local clinical teams.
Yep.
But then we're also still always using the ADOS also for research. So our training has this dual purpose for clinicians and to promote understanding about autism amongst clinicians,
and
but
best
also
practice skills as well in those
Yeah,
clinicians in the communities that they're in.
and certainly those on your course this time here in Australia, we've again got a mixture of clinicians and researchers who are wanting to use this assessment. The information you get and then the quality of the report can inform a child's individual education plan or their individual intervention plan, and highlight, which is so important as part of a diagnostic evaluation, their skills and needs, strengths and impairments, as well as whether or not the child's profile might fit the behavioural phenotype, probably shouldn't use that term, but the behavioural characteristics of a diagnosis of ASD.
Right. Yeah.
Because we don't have a blood test
That's
or
right,
whatever.
genetic
We
test,
are
something.
making these diagnoses on the pattern of the developmental history and current functioning.
Behaviour.
Now, of course, that does mean this is an observational assessment in one setting that the examiner has created. So it needs to be complemented by further evaluations, observations in school, understanding the parent's perspective and the issues from home, speech and language assessment, cognitive assessment if appropriate. So there'll be, and other medical investigations as appropriate for the clinical presentation of that child at that stage in their development.
So I remember thinking back on my learning about autism. I did my PhD here in Australia, and then I went to work in the UK for 5 years, and that's when I met you.
Together.
And we worked together, and I felt that when I learnt the ADOS, when I finally learnt how to administer this assessment that I'd read all about in these research papers and heard about but hadn't had the chance to use yet, that was when I suddenly understood what ASD was. And what I think the ADOS does really nicely is it helps new clinicians to really understand the variety of what is ASDs. We know these are a spectrum of disorders, they present differently in different individuals, and I think for a new person coming into the field it can be really hard to understand, well, how is this presentation and this very different presentation called the same thing? Why are they the same thing? What is common to them? But what allows them to be the same thing even though they present differently? And I really like the ADOS for that purpose. We have a 1 hour video recorded or audio recorded presentation on this that people can access by going to our website and clicking on the ADOS Explained. Will take you to an iTunes U video where I sort of talk about what I think the value of the ADOS is beyond just helping make the decision of the diagnosis. So like you say, getting a really good profile of strengths and weaknesses of the child or the adult, whoever it is being assessed. But I think one step further, I think ADOS training really helps new clinicians to very quickly come up to a very good understanding of what autism is in all of its sort of rainbow of different presentations and things like that. I don't know whether the ADOS was around clinically when your son was having his diagnosis, or whether you've heard of it as a parent and a professional even at this stage.
Yeah. I've certainly heard of the ADOS in my role at Autism Victoria. But as sitting here as a parent, listening to Anne and listening to you now, I'm thinking, wow, how helpful is this for parents? Are they very involved? I don't know the process of administering the ADOS. Are parents very involved? Do they get a lot of feedback? Do they get some good guidance from the findings?
Yep. And I guess this is where, for me, I really am wanting to try and bring the ADOS into the Australian community in the way I see it working in the UK, where I think the network of trainers and people trying to then skill up clinicians to use this, but then the things you can do, you can get out of an ADOS assessment beyond just the, does this seem to be ASD, yes or no, all the rich information, feeding that back to parents.
That
for
is
that
so
to be
important.
Useful. Yeah.
I'm even wondering now, can a 32-year-old?
Absolutely.
Because I feel sure I would learn a great deal more.
Yeah.
You know, my son has a very complex presentation, and I don't really understand a lot of what's going on, or a lot of what's driving his behaviours and his responses. So just sitting here as a parent, I'm hoping that through the work you're doing and others, that where there's going to be a lot of access to clinicians who have the ADOS training. Can I ask, is it psychologists, is it paediatricians, is it speech pathologists? What clinicians?
Yeah, I mean, you may have a different view.
Good question.
From my point of view, it's educated professionals, so we're wanting to teach people who already we know will come to a course with a certain background level of understanding of development and behaviour and so on. But beyond that, fantastic if we can have a real range of allied health and medical professionals. On our course, you know, the course we're running at the moment, we have 16 trainees. We have one paediatrician, one occupational therapist, the rest are psychologists.
Okay.
But on other courses, there will be different mixes. There will be others as well.
That tends to be the pattern here, or certainly in Victoria, and I suspect the rest of Australia, that the psychologists have really taken the lead.
Often
in
the
that
speech
assessment
pathologists
process.
as well, occupational therapists. The really nice thing, and you say in this area, but actually of our trainees, we have 2 trainees at least, even perhaps 3 come from Perth for this course, one from Townsville, another from Brisbane. So we're actually getting people from all over the country coming for this, which is really exciting, I think.
And we are modelling, the course is being run by a developmental psychologist and me as a developmental child and adolescent psychiatrist. So I think that's important. I mean, one of the problems, though, is that any one diagnostic tool can't be used in isolation. So I tease trainees coming on these courses to be saying, you know, you've invested all your time and training to train on a diagnostic tool which you cannot use to make a diagnosis in isolation. It is a very particular, it's an active assessment because it's a way of assessing in a standardised way, social communication, presence of other behaviours and so on, but it doesn't then deal with the mental state or all the other additional problems that children with autism, individuals with autism, we know, you know, most young people or individuals with autism will have additional other problems, behaviour problems, mental health problems, etc. So the ADOS won't cover all of that, but it does give you a very rich opportunity to work together with the child you're assessing or the young person or indeed the adult you're assessing, but it has to be complemented by that wider pool of information.
Which really takes to what we've really hammered for so many years in Victoria, is the importance of the multidisciplinary assessment, the multidisciplinary approach to assessing a child, not just for a diagnosis but for further, you know, planning,
all the rich information,
and
which of course is really difficult to fund, and resources are becoming more and more stretched, both in our opportunities here in Australia and in the UK, but of course in other countries where there may be less resources. Again, how you achieve a multidisciplinary assessment with minimal resources, we need to think about using the resources we're lucky enough to have efficiently. And I think we believe that the ADOS is a useful way of doing that. We're not saying every individual should necessarily have an ADOS, but to have that as part of the repertoire of the skills of the professionals who are involved, we obviously believe is helpful. Otherwise we wouldn't be trying to run these courses.
That's right. And they are intensive. I mean, it's a week of these clinicians' time and a lot of practice, and actually we're going to be sending them away with a lot of work that they need to do to then get reliable and to know that they're doing it well. So what we sort of wanted to talk about today, and we're starting to get into that direction, is really then trying to bring communities together, the researchers, the academics, the clinicians in the communities, clinicians at the universities, and parents as well, and sort of really trying to develop partnerships here, as we've sort of seen is happening in the UK using the ADOS, but even more broadly than that, we wanted to discuss today of bringing the different stakeholders out in the community in, I guess, to the university to work with the academics, with the researchers, with the clinical academics like yourself, to really start to have some good partnerships here. So moving, I guess, away from the ADOS now, I wanted to talk about some other initiatives that we're seeing around the world, and then also hear about some of both of your experiences of as a parent and as a professional working with research, and Anne as a clinical academic working with parents in research. Let's first talk about a new initiative that we've just seen come out in the last week or so in September, that's come out of the Wales Autism Research Centre. So this is a website which is called the Autism Research Policy Practice Hub, and this is something that's quite exciting, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. So again, we have a link available directly to this Autism Research Policy and Practice Hub, and what you can see the Wales Autism Research Group, led by the director Sue Leakham, are doing is trying to have a forum, a common space where different stakeholders from the community, so parents, individuals with an autism spectrum disorder themselves, clinicians, professionals of different types, can come together and have discussions with researchers around research, what's currently known, what's coming out, around policy for autism, around practice as well. So this is something that seems like a really innovative, I think, and really potentially exciting platform to have discussions between different types of individuals all coming together about this. What are your thoughts on this as a parent? What do you think of something like this, and as a professional?
Yes, I've had a little bit of a look at it. Very ambitious was my first thought, very ambitious. It will be interesting to see who sort of just through natural processes become involved. So for example, with the Autistic Family Support Association, I'll send out a little round to say, oh, hey, look at this, go and have a look at this website. But so it's going to rely, I think, to get the parent stakeholders' involvement is going to rely a lot on word of mouth or word of internet click, however you want to express it these days. And I'm sort of presuming the same would happen with practitioners as well. A lot of practitioners are very isolated from, the hubs of activity where all this is happening. And so I think it will also be interesting to see how effective the developers of this site, of this program, I guess you could call it, are going to be able to sell it, to get it, the word out there to the practitioners. But then, of course, the elephant in the room is how do we get it to the policy people and to the politicians and to the bureaucrats. And that's going to require, I think, a lot of, what shall we say, lobbying on the part of the parents and the practitioners and presumably the research community as well. So that were my sort of thoughts, but very exciting. I love anything like that anyway.
Yeah. How about you, Anne? What are your
One
thoughts?
of the advantages for Wales doing this is as you'll see at the bottom of their homepage. Can we just show that? There. I think that's what I'm looking, yes. So one of the advantages of this for Wales is the Welsh Assembly has had an autism programme for quite a number of years, and indeed the academic centre at Cardiff University was set up several years ago now, perhaps we're getting up to 5 years, in collaboration with funding from Cardiff University, funding from the Welsh Assembly, and indeed funding from one of the UK autism research charities. So they set up a research autism centre led by Sue Leakham, who's actually a great friend of all of ours.
Yes, I know Sue too.
And so yes, it is ambitious. It's part of their national strategy for Wales, but also wanting it to be used much further afield. And your point about how to share the information, part of the opening activities of this is that Sue has persuaded several of us to run online days about diagnostic tools. So Professor David Skews from Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, who led the development of the 3DI, which is another developmental history framework, me for the Autism Diagnostic Interview, and Judith Gould, who you will...
with Disco.
With the Disco. So that's another diagnostic assessment tool. And we will be running between October, November and through to early next year, online days. Not that I have to sit at my computer for the whole day, but to run a kind of online symposium about the diagnostic tools, and I'm sure they'll continue to do those sort of activities. So there are a number of websites, and one of the great things about using the web is, of course, you don't have to be physically there.
No, so I was wondering whether Australian families could tap into this, do you think, or whether we would need something like this in Australia for our families separate.
Well, I think a bit of both. So there are websites, so we have a database for children in the northeast of England, and the database provides information for local, anonymised obviously, but for local families and local professionals and researchers, and we try, but that's just for the northeast, and we try and make sure we've got some useful information, so latest facts, contentious issues. Part of our newsletter will be information about sleeping problems or challenging behaviour. But we also try, and so we had a little article about the new DSM-5 published this year. So these things can complement each other, but also I think it can then alert you to something else. So one of the things I've spotted that actually I can't find now that the website's been launched are links to another charity in the UK which is called Research Autism, all one word. And families and professionals anywhere in the world can access Research Autism if they want some information about evaluation of interventions. So I do think something like this in Australia will be helpful, because your local networks and your exciting research here at La Trobe University and other Australian research centres, it's helpful to share that information locally, but then how it links with what's happening in the States with some of the large family cohort studies and other web-based research opportunities. And that's the other thing that I think will be helpful for you to do something similar in Australia, is how you bring families together and adults and individuals with ASD who want to help drive in partnership research agendas or take part in research.
So you've had a lot of experience, we've been discussing over the week, about in the northeast of England trying to really involve all of the different types of stakeholders in this sort of thing. Do you want to tell us about some of your experiences with that?
This is a passion of mine, so we have been discussing this all week.
It's so interesting, and to hear it all is from Anne, it's great.
We have, now for most research grants, although I don't think that should be the main driver, but it is one of the drivers, it's very important, I think, to establish public patient involvement in what you're doing. And the surveys that we might come on to, again, talk about how do you make progress with understanding autism unless you're involving families, but also individuals with autism themselves, or autism spectrum disorder. We're using, for the purposes of this morning, the terms interchangeably. How do you set the research agenda? What's the most important? How do we know for adults as they grow up how they should access public services? Which public services are most appropriate? How we should modify the social opportunities to allow, that's our problem, to allow adults with autism to access resources. What is it that allows an adult with autism, of course, across the broad spectrum, to improve their own quality of experience and life, into employment? These kind of questions. How do you have a productive old age when you have autism? How do you access physical health care? If, for you, social, engaging in your local hospital or going to your practitioner, whatever it be, and the services are arranged differently, I appreciate that. But actually, if communicating and your social communication is not a strength for you, how do you make sure you're looking after your general health? These kind of issues we've not researched yet.
No, I think the field as a whole is really starting to appreciate that we're focusing a lot of our efforts on early years, and this is important. Early diagnosis, early intervention is important, but at the neglect of the adults and what's happening there.
Totally concur with that, and certainly in my conversations with families, and really for the last decade or so, it's been a common theme. I've got so many friends whose children are now adults in their 20s, 30s and 40s, of course, and there's no help for them to understand what's happening, to understand how to plan. I mean, there are policies there. We've got, in Victoria, we've got various processes that one must follow in order to access funding, in order to access services. But there's no real interconnectedness, and I think that's what I'm hearing you say, working towards developing an interconnectedness, because at the moment everyone's working in isolation.
That's right.
Particularly in the adult area, from that period, school, post-school onwards.
We're starting to see, just this year, we've seen a 40-year follow-up from Pat Howland and colleagues in the UK of some of the earliest sort of individuals with ASD, and then who have been followed now into adulthood. So that's very exciting. So the field is headed that way, and at the international conferences that we go to, we're starting to hear more about adults, and there are sessions dedicated to adult, which is great, but there's certainly a long way to go, isn't there? I did want to flag the CRC, the Cooperative Research Centre for Living with Autism Spectrum Disorders. We've mentioned this briefly during the week, but this, again, we have a link to this on our website, which is easy to follow to get to the CRC homepage. So just for people who might not be aware of this, it's an 8-year federally funded project, a cooperative research centre, so sort of a virtual centre but headed out of the University of Queensland in the Long Pocket precinct. But trying to really engage researchers and other stakeholders right across the country of Australia to address 3 key areas. One of those is early identification, early diagnosis. So that sort of is still a really important area, because the more we can do there, hopefully the better outcomes for people. Another is the childhood years and schooling. So how can we best educate these kids? We're knowing a lot now about early intervention, but what about education? Once these kids get to school, how can we best support them? But really exciting is the third core program of the CRC, which is adulthood. So trying to really help adults with autism to find their place in society. So to find either further education once they leave school or employment, and also to deal with the comorbid sort of issues that come or that are there from even earlier on, but in adulthood, the anxiety, depression, the physical health and those sorts of things. So I think there's exciting things to follow here, but we certainly are at a starting point, aren't we?
Yes,
there's a lot to be done.
Yes. Well, I would imagine that the Autism CRC is going to feed into a lot of work that I've been reading about that's been done in the UK, and of course there's quite a bit in the US and a few other places, not too many, but a few other places. So it is very exciting, and certainly I was particularly pleased to see that third element of the project, because that's obviously where I'm at the moment.
Right.
And for me, there just simply isn't enough information about the trajectory that these people follow. Now, David was in many senses a pioneer. He was one of the first to do in a specifically funded early intervention program for children with autism in 1985. He was one of the first to go to a regular mainstream primary school with integration aid funding. He was one of the first in the post-school option program that was called Futures for Young Adults. He's now at 32 and he's in limbo. So even though he's pioneered wonderful developments that are there for others, as a 32-year-old, he really is in a state of limbo. And he himself expresses, why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? Why can't I go to places the same as the people I went to at primary school with? Are the sorts of questions he asks. And I can't answer those. And unfortunately, I don't think anybody else can at the moment. Here in Australia, I'm not so sure about the UK, but certainly here in Australia.
I think the interesting thing, seeing this paper with a 40-year follow-up as well, is thinking that's excellent, that's the right step forward. But we have to remember that 40 years ago, what was autism then is very different to what is autism in children now as well. So even if we're starting to follow up at 40 years now, the children who were seen then, that's not necessarily then going to tell us what children diagnosed now are going to be like in 40 years either. So that's something for the field to consider.
The interventions that they had 40 years ago. I mean, 40 years ago in Australia, there would virtually have been no intervention. They would still have been deemed ineducable. As I said, David was one of the first, and that was 28, 29 years ago.
One of the important things to point out about the CRC, and I think it fits nicely with what we've been talking about, is that it really is driven by the end user. So it's really been about developing a research program. So a program of research, it really is for research money, but which is driven by outcomes that are needed in the community. So ensuring that the community service providers are able to diagnose and identify early, ensuring that the community is able to support children in schools, ensuring the community is able to support adults with autism. So I think that's really nice. It's about, again, trying to pull together now stakeholders of different types out there with research to really work together rather than working completely in isolation.
That's right.
And I think all of us have learned over time that the research question is best if it's developed in partnership.
That's right. And so I guess that makes me think about sort of if we are going to start moving more towards working really in partnership, that is going to be a different thing for a lot of us who've been used to sort of in our lab doing our thing, answering the things that interest us and that make us kind of think, oh, that sounds curious. So, and I guess I wanted to find out a bit more about your experiences of having started to do these databases where you are having individuals with autism, parents, professionals working with you in partnership. What are some of the challenges that might come with that? Because I'm sure there are some.
There certainly are challenges. When we first developed our autism clinical academic research team, as I talked about in the northeast of England, we had the wonderful opportunity for funding actually from the Northern Rock Foundation originally, together with the university, to help us start what's called DASL. So that's our database for children with autism spectrum disorder living in the Northeast. That's how we spell DASL for this particular title. And we were able to recruit a group of, actually, as it's turned out, very ambitious families. So parents who were committed to this vision of developing a local database. They probably set the targets too high, because we were very clear about, as we developed the questionnaires, for example, for families joining the database, the parents who were helping us design these were very keen. We had a lot of information, and actually we're having to tailor that back a little bit, because for some families, particularly if we're wanting to encourage families to join the database around the time that they're getting a diagnosis, they've got a lot going on. But for the 6, if you like, counties around Newcastle University, we try with this particular database to encourage all families, whatever age the child or young person receives a diagnosis, we offer them the opportunity of joining the database, so that we have a representative sample. And we've looked at how representative the group that are joining the database. So we're only recruiting probably about 50% of families. It's different in different districts, and it varies across time, because of course the professionals change and other things change. Circumstances are changing all the time, aren't they? And how we're maintaining the funding of the database is not an inconsiderable problem. But our idea is that it's a resource then for the Northeast. It's different from, we also have something called ASD UK, which has started in the last 2 years, also from Newcastle University actually, but with my colleague Jeremy Parr, we've developed an ASD wide database. That's for families to volunteer, to want to take part in research. Our DASL database is really, it complements ASD UK, but we want it so that we can recruit representative samples of children, young people and their families. So at the moment, families stay on till the children are 18. We have the ethical committee's agreement that we can keep the data, but young people may decide they don't want to take part in the database. But just like your son's grown up, DASL's grown up, so we're now over 10 years old, so we've got children and young people who we're now contacting again to ask, are they interested in taking part in research themselves, and then take responsibility for keeping their names on the databases as adults. Time moves on for all of us, doesn't it? But the great thing about the DASL database and how it's changed over time is we've very much done this in partnership with local service providers, most importantly the families. So our steering group, the research and publications committee, all the other, and we have a separate parents subcommittee, but all the committees don't function and don't have a meeting if there aren't enough parents there. So we have a set of parents that support each other in their parents group, but they are also guiding and leading how we steer the database in the future directions. So it's parents who've said to us, for goodness sake, get this all electronic so parents can join and families can join electronically rather than using the questionnaires. Parents opt and elect to which professional they want to fill out the questionnaire to complement their own questionnaire as they join the database. And parents have recently said to us, so we had one of the underpinning policies of the database was we would not approach families more than twice a year with research projects, and the parents are now saying to us, why on earth are you making that judgment on our behalf? We're perfectly capable of making. So if parents are actually involved or families are involved in a study, clearly at that time we wouldn't tell them about other projects because it may affect the work they're already doing. But if they're not taking part in the studies, the parents have said to us, please stop making this decision for us. We've also surveyed them about genetic information. I mean, it's a wonderful source. So we often, the database can be used for pilot studies to then provide the data for larger multi-site studies or for questionnaires that we're running across the database. And we are now with the parents thinking about, because obviously the parents set it up with us in partnership, we're now thinking about how actually do we broaden the research focus to thinking about siblings, grandparents, other family members. And we haven't really used the database up until now, even though we've got 2,000 families on it. We haven't really used it up until now, but we feel it should be a resource that can then allow siblings to have a voice
Yeah.
in research, other family members to have a voice. So that's
Okay.
a new challenge. And this
Interesting.
month we've just gone live so that people can join electronically, which of course is a whole different set of issues.
Yeah. So have you been involved, I mean, you've clearly as a parent had a professional role in autism. Have you had a role in research as a parent?
Yes,
What are your
that
reflections
was
on that?
really the first links I made was through the professional who diagnosed David, and obviously it was at a university. So yes, so that's sort of my background and what I'm interested in. So I can remember very clearly when I was first told that David had this thing called autism, I had to go away and look it up because I didn't know what it was, never heard of it before. But that's my inquiring mind. So I think, you know, there are parents who really do want to be involved because they know that research but whatever research type of research it is, whether it's theoretical research or applied research, is going to give answers to questions that they have.
And if not for their child, for someone
For
else's.
others,
Yeah.
yes. So David has, we've done a lot of things. He's had the first PET scan of a brain that Professor Bruce Tong did some years ago over at the Austin. We've collected wee samples, we've played games, we've filled out numerous surveys. He did a lot of the early Sally Ann experiment, you know, the theory of mind.
Yeah.
And in doing all that, of course, I learnt a great deal. And I also learnt a great deal about the research process and about the research community. And, you know, I know a significant number of key researchers here in Australia as a result of that. So that was really me as an inquiring parent. And I don't know whether I'm a rare breed or whether a lot of parents are like
Christelle's
that.
point a moment ago is so crucial. So for parents and families taking part in the research, this isn't going to give you answers necessarily for your child because, you know, this is an investment. The research process is the wrong timeline and time frame for the parents that are taking part. So actually all our work is absolutely dependent on the generosity of the children, young people and adults now and their families that are taking part in research.
Well, when I moved to Autism Victoria, I maintained that interest in research. So I did implement a number of initiatives at the organisation to try and encourage parents to participate. Looked at what will encourage, what are the factors that will encourage parents, and the sorts of things parents were saying was we don't want it to be so theoretical that we don't understand it. We want to understand, you know, what is the hypothesis? What are the possible findings? What are the possible benefits? They wanted to be valued, particularly in respect of follow-up, finding out getting the findings, getting a copy of the report. Yes. So I actually implemented in our magazine research reports where researchers could do little parent-friendly, consumer-friendly summaries of their research. Also set up the research forum that is still happening, that Autism Victoria still runs.
In November it will be, won't it?
Yes, and just generally engage. We also set up the research reference group too. So just generally trying to bring those together in a very small way. I just sitting listening to your database in Newcastle and thinking how much it must have cost, not just in dollars but in time. Huge numbers of people, and I would imagine quite a bit of that time could have been voluntary time as well. It would be wonderful to have something like that in Australia, in Victoria, but it's a huge task. And how wonderful that you would have been pioneers, because 10 years ago, to start to build up a database.
Nice.
I think so, yes. I certainly wasn't aware of it. I should have been, but I wasn't. What a wonderful, rich lot of information that you must have, because clearly you're asking questionnaires, so getting not just names and addresses, but quite a bit of other information.
There is a lot of work, and one of the difficulties, and we were saying that about the Wales New Initiative, is you know, how do you keep something up to date?
Yeah.
So for our database, if parents fill out and their elected professional fill out a questionnaire at the beginning, we can't guarantee that when new researchers want to access the database to recruit subjects for their particular study, that the information may not be as up to date as they want, because of course how you keep it up to date, and we may have the baseline data. So we're trying to develop ways of then using the information from a new study to help us with maintaining the database. But you're quite right, all these things take a while. But it is good fun. I mean, the other thing about disseminating information is we have a celebratory conference every 2 years. It's really for the families on the database, but we tolerate the professionals coming too. And then we get the researchers to talk about the findings from our North East families, and then how that fits in with other groups. But also, and I would really encourage you to do this, we run workshops at the conferences so that families, parents and others are helping us set the agenda for what should be the priorities. So what are the topics, I mean obviously in discussion with all of us, but what are the topics they would like the database to be used for? So we've surveyed attitudes to transition and moving into adulthood. Absolutely fascinating. No time enough to share it with you now. And then some of these additional problems, like sleep problems, as we've all already talked about, dietary problems, fatty eating and so on, are things that families are still wanting investigated, as well as the symptomatology of autism, or how we should be modifying interventions into mainstream school, or helping young people access leisure and sports facilities. We know that's important for health, but how do we help young people do that? Especially as at the moment, unfortunately, a minority of adults with autism, able individuals, are not in paid employment. So they have long hours, you know, long days, where actually being able to constructively use leisure activities, and how should we be modifying how we facilitate? We've no idea.
Well, I think this is a topic we could really talk about for hours, isn't it? There's so many different things here. What strikes me with the parents who we have participate in things here at OTARC, so our research, but also our forums, our discussion, is on the one hand the real generosity of these families. So like you say, they're not participating, they're not in it for themselves and what they'll gain for their child and family, but actually to really broaden what we all know for future families as well. But also the thirst for knowledge, so really the thirst for a lot of these families to participate, to help find out more, and so that they can find out again more for themselves, but for others as well. I think the risks that we're going to have to sort of think about as we're working towards really partnering with families are some of the things you raised, and about the ambitiousness of things that families want to be researched, and balancing that with the realism and the timelines of the scientific process, and how things have to be done really carefully and systematically so that we can interpret the findings, not just quickly going out and targeting the one thing that's the hot topic of the moment, but that doesn't have the groundwork or so on. So there's a lot of work we need to do. I think we could have separate discussions on each of those topics, but I think we might have to leave that there for today.
One of the things I would like to say at the end, though, is that I think using the internet and your website that combines information about service provision that you've evaluated, and the services. You talked earlier on about how will the Welsh site moderate what the content. I think for families who maybe have just had a diagnosis, or a young person who's not sure what to do, they will be accessing the internet. And so for us to provide the evidence base that we know about, and the areas of uncertainty or careful links to other websites, because there are millions of sites now with autism in the title. Very hard for families and service, any other service user to know. And so I think the fact that you're wanting to develop this here, I think is fantastic, and it can link with the small things we're doing in the UK, some of the much larger opportunities in the States. And then, of course, remember, those from resource-poor environments can, I mean, Australia is a fantastic model for telemedicine. So being able to use that for the wider community in Australia and beyond, you know, don't underestimate the importance of of your site and
all the information we can share on it.
You can provide.
So thanks very much to Anne Lakuta for visiting Australia and sharing the ADOS training that we're doing together, and also your knowledge and experience from all of the other activities you do in your role.
It's lovely to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for Amanda Golding for coming and giving a perspective which really is a multi-perspective from the parent point of view, professional, but also you have been involved with researchers and sort of helping us to think about that and how that might move forward
My
as
pleasure,
well.
thank you.
Thanks very much.